The Face in the Frost by John Bellairs, 9. Anyone foolish enough to stand on barren Tor in the booming wind of a certain wintry day in late October would have seen a box carriage scooting past below, like a black beetle. The Tor, a treeless 300-foot-high hill, shaped a little like a dog's tooth, was an isolated foothill of an unnamed range of peaks that bordered the northern highlands. Northerners did not name mountain ranges. They were afraid that doing so would wake the spirit of the mountains, the rock-buried elemental that had once split the Mitre, a strange double peak many miles to the south. Roger and Prospero, now many days' journey from the clockmaker's cottage, had passed the Mitre a week before. It was there that they heard the rumors of the war council on the feasting hill. The kings were gathering, getting ready for a march on the south. They had been told that by their astrologers that the fear came from the south. And so they had not destroyed the wooden bridges as Roger thought they would. Instead, they held both sides of the river with cavalry, and these men waited for the messengers from the hill. The Southerners, no matter how well organized they were, had only fat plow horses to ride. They would be unable to prevent a march on Round Court, a city with beautiful walls of painted wood and a tiny, unreliable garrison. A quick surrender of the capital might save a lot of lives, but skirmishing and raiding could go on for a long time, and Prospero knew the temperament of certain southern rulers who would, after the victorious northern kings had gone home, hold their own witch trials and take out their anger on disloyal, that is, weak kings like silly old Gorm. Meanwhile, the strange early winter threw thin rags and fingers of gray snow over the dirty, fast-decaying leaves that clotted the suddenly dry beds of streams on the empty plain Prospero and Roger had just passed through. The snow moved in eerie swirls, falling into spirals and long lines too regular to be natural. People were terrified of the open spaces at night. In their homes, they sat with blankets over their windows so that they would not see the mask of frost. Windows broke in the night, and the wind that blew through them had a voice. On this last leg of the journey, Prospero and Roger traveled all the time, taking turns driving and sleeping as they had for weeks before they got to the farmer's house. With a candlestick in an ashtray, Prospero sat up late, pipe in mouth, turning over pages, looking for what he knew was not there. They passed through shallow valleys where muddy pools of fog blew crazily about. Long, grasping fingers of it seeped through the floorboards of the carriage and thrust in at the windows. Roger raised his hand once to wave it away, and for an instant he felt something hard. The fog curled back and drifted outside again. In one shuttered hiding town, a signboard screeched in a way that made the horses rear up and almost tip over the carriage. Prospero raised a curtain and looked out. He was not surprised to see that the board was washed clean of any design. And now the moon began to rise into a starless night. We who are used to empty or rusty night skies of modern cities would not understand the fear that the people of Prospero's world felt when they saw this. They saw a haggard moon with pinched brows and grieving mouth rising into a blackness distinct and calling. Like children lying on grass and looking into a cloud-vaulted daytime sky, they felt that they were going to fall upwards. Hollow ocean depths hung overhead, so that looking up was like standing on the edge of a cliff. The road ran over steeper hills now. Prospero was always half surprised when an appalling height flattened out under the wheels of the carriage. From a distance, it looked as though you would have to cling to the gravel with your fingers and toes. At last, though they were in the mountains, these were not Himalayan peaks, but some of them were tall enough to thrust broken and tilting horns through frozen mats of cloud. Others were long blue ridges covered with pines. On their bristly sides you could see the zigzag lines of roads built by an ancient people no one in the north knew anything about. Whoever they were, they had dug long tunnels with decorated mouths, and built rope-lashed wooden bridges that never rotted, and had carved the mouths of rock springs into bug-eyed monsters that disturbed the dreams of travelers who came upon them at night. Prospero and Roger, looking out of their wide windows at the long, frightening drop-offs, saw few of these vomiting horrors sticking out of dead leaf clusters, or the wiry skeletons of bushes, but they seemed silly alongside the other fear. Now Prospero had his glasses on, and he was running his finger along a line on a wrinkly map spread over both their laps. "You see, Roger, around the next big bend and up a road that goes through a long tunnel. There are 3 gates, 1 for wagons and 2 for men. There's bound to be some barrier, though, if the valley is inhabited. It's the perfect fortified place, too. The mountain is like a big tooth with a cavity." "Charming metaphor," said Roger, feeling his jaw with his fingertips. "Well, it is. Sheer walls and peaks that have been rounded by the wind. The bowl of grass inside must be about a mile across. Watch out. Here's the bend." When the carriage had rounded an upended chunk of rock that looked like the prow of a sinking boat, the carved triple entrance was there, but some barrier proved to be a large understatement. Each of the 3 wide-lipped arches was blocked by a portcullis of thick square iron bars. Behind each grate, at the distance of about 20 feet, was another grate, and so on, as far as they could see in the rising coal-faced tunnels. The 2 men could only sit there and wonder how the black iron frames had been fitted into place, and whether they were lowered and raised by counterweights or by hand winches. "Well," said Roger as he got out of the carriage, "whoever they are, they're protected." He picked up a stone and threw it at the gate. It pinged and flew back at him. "They certainly are," said Prospero, "and what is more, since I threw the taros away, I don't believe I have the power to rip up cardboard. Destroying spells have never been much in my line anyway. "Or mine," said Roger. He pounded his staff on the ground in frustration, threw it down, turned on his heel, and stomped off into some high bushes at the side of the road. By the by, he shoved the branches away from him. Prospero could tell Roger was angry. He expected him to kick around in the bushes, swearing for a while, so he was surprised when Roger came back immediately with a smile on his face. "Come here," he said. "I want you to see something." Roger led Prospero back through the bushes, for Cynthia of all things, like the ones in Prospero's backyard, and down a steep sandy path to a little lookout point. Across a small grassy valley, which was already beginning to fill with the reddish-brown mist of sunset, there was a square tower on a tall spiny pinnacle of rock. The light was bad, and even with his telescope, Roger could not be sure, but it looked as though the tower was attached to the face of the mountain by a small arched bridge. Roger was pointing excitedly. "Look, Prospero, there's our way in. Do you suppose it's a watchtower? If it is, there'll be soldiers, but if they don't have 17 portcullises to hide behind, we may be able to get in." Prospero borrowed a telescope and squinted. "No, it certainly doesn't look like a watchtower. At least it wasn't built for that purpose. It has 4 little pinnacles with knobbly ornaments on them. Looks like a church tower, but where is the church that goes with it?" "Whatever it is," Roger said, "I suggest that we head for it. If it's abandoned, and it isn't a way in, we can stay there the night. The carriage and horses will have to stay here, but there's some grass by the roadside. If anyone tries to steal the rig, they will go home in a squash." "All fine and good," said Prospero, "but we are here and the tower is there. It looks about 300 feet down to the ground, and I doubt if that boat in your bag flies." "You might look over the edge of the cliff," said Roger. Prospero did, and he saw stairs, wide stone slabs, some broken, some worn into cups in the middle, running back and forth down the cliff face. "You wait here," said Roger. "I'll unhitch the horses and get the bags." Soon they were picking their way down the steep railless stairway. Prospero's acrophobia was as bad as ever, if not worse. He kept his eyes on the rock wall and rubbed it with his shoulder, though it would have taken a concerted effort or a high wind to throw him off. At some points they found landings, wide stone platforms with parapets and stacks of boulders. These rocks, which were not too large to be lifted by strong men, had probably been put there to be dropped on the heads of pursuers. They had been there so long that they appeared to have melted into pointed humps, like piles of snowballs that were never used. When the wizards got to the bottom of the cliff, they looked across the grassy field. A light was burning high up in the tower. As they started towards it, Prospero talked to Roger about the quietness and warmth of the mountain valley. The strange snows, the frightening sounds and sights of the plain below were not there. Twilight was drawing on, soft and deep blue, and stars could be seen overhead. It was warm for October, too. Prospero even imagined that he heard the slow finger and comb sound of crickets. The remark about this being perhaps the eye of the storm was too obvious and too frightening to be made by either of them. When they got close to the tower, they found they were standing in the middle of jumbled stone blocks. Carved and pie-faced angels stared out of bushes and ditches, and a red flaking iron cross stood upright in the middle of a wild rose bush. This was the church, destroyed by some landslide or earthquake. The tower rose straight above them on its freakish nail of rock, which was wrapped around by another stair. This one, railed for a change. "This is all very convenient," said Prospero, looking up at the long lighted window. "I hope we are not going to be the guests of some ogre." "We shall see," said Roger, and they started up. At the top of the stairs they saw an open arched door, and in front of it stood a blond-bearded monk. He was holding a metal basket of fire on a wooden stick, and when they reached the last few steep steps, he stuck the torch in the wall and helped them up. "Greetings," he said. "Welcome to the Green Oratory. I'm here by myself, and I'm probably the only monk for miles." "I wouldn't be so sure," said Roger. He tipped his hat and showed the bald spot on his red-fringed head. "What are you doing up here?" "I grow plants," said the monk, "and I do things with them. Come in and let me show you around." The guided tour of the Green Oratory showed that the monk indeed grew plants, lime trees in tubs, frazzled cacti in barrels, Jack in the pulpits in pots, and Venus flytraps in cages. He had built flooring to divide the bell tower into rooms. They were connected by ladders, but Prospero's fear of heights extended to fear of straight-up ladders, so he went up the dumbwaiter with the luggage. When they came to the top of the belfry, there were the bells, dirty and pigeon-streaked, but they had been turned upside down and filled with dirt. Vines and creepers with purple leaves and red waxy droplet flowers dripped over their sides. The monk would not tell Prospero and Roger how he kept the steamy atmosphere of an arboretum in this cold stone building, but he did enjoy exchanging plant information with Prospero. Now they were on the roof, where all sorts of night-blooming flowers opened. Bells, trumpets, and puffy Chinese lantern mouths. The roof of the tower was covered with a burgundy-colored moss that Prospero had never seen before. Roger was smiling and shaking his head while the monk walked around, fingering leaves and talking proudly of his collection. Prospero finally had to interrupt him. "Please, all this is lovely, but we've got to get to the village beyond this mountain. Is there any way in?" The monk looked unhappy. "I saw you coming down the stairs on the other side, so I guess you know about those gates. The villagers chased me out a couple of months ago when I was picking mushrooms at night. They have plants up there that you wouldn't believe. Why?" "Oh, yes, no. That's the only way up. But why go there? It's really not a very friendly place these days." "I can explain," said Prospero, thinking wearily of the people to whom he had said I can't explain, said Prospero, thinking wearily of all the people to whom he had said I can't explain. "But we've got to get in. Haven't you been wondering why it's still almost like summer up here in this valley? And haven't you heard what's happening down below?" The monk pointed a little white dovecote in the corner. "I've heard it all right from them, and I hope I can ride it out. I don't know much magic except plant magic, but I can tell you that this is not a healthy place now. It's close and muggy down in that valley. There at night, come over to the edge and look down." Prospero and Roger saw blue mist floating below. It was like water, and like water it distorted shapes. Broken rocks looked wavy, and tall stalks bent sharply at the top. Long grass was rippling like weeds at the bottom of a stream. "It all looks as though it might blow away in a minute," said the monk. "When I'm down there at night, I don't feel real at all." "I've seen worse than that down on the plain," said Prospero. and we may be able to stop all this. God knows how. Isn't there any way up? Think. The monk walked around, pounding his fists on his head. He kicked a tin watering can across the roof. We up, see. No, that's ridiculous. Still, wait here a minute. He went down through the trap door and made a lot of noise in the room below. When he came back up, he was carrying 2 pots, and in each one was an ordinary-looking creeper vine. This, he said, is sensitive anaconda. It looks like creeping Charlie to me, said Prospero, who had such a plant in his front parlor. The monk looked hurt. Well, it doesn't, and it may get you over that wall. Follow me, and may I request silence? Prospero and Roger followed the monk, who solemnly carried the plants, each in one hand, across the little wooden bridge that connected the tower with the mountain. On the other side was a narrow rock shelf, and beyond it was a dank-smelling mushroom cave. The procession stopped at the mouth of the cave, and the monk set the plants down. He looked up at the slightly furrowed granite wall that rose at least 100 feet above the shelf. It was not only perpendicular, it actually seemed to lean out a bit at the top. Now he began to conjure, and his style was odd. He stood with his hand over his face, muttering as if he were trying to remember the answer to a hard question. As he talked, the plants rose, swaying like charmed snakes. They dug green tendrils into the smooth rock, making cracks where they did not find them. Up they went, wriggling and twisting until the tops of the 2 vines were out of sight. The monk waited, tapping his foot. Suddenly the vines tightened, vibrating like plucked strings. They had caught hold of some rocks at the top. Prospero looked pale. Excuse me, he said, but I'm not very good at climbing. I get dizzy in the lower limbs of apple trees. Well, lucky man that you are, you won't have to climb, said the monk. Hold this. He put a pot in each man's hand. The vines, imitating the corkscrew motion that the monk now made with his finger, wrapped themselves tightly around the wizard several times around. He gave each man his bag and staff. And so farewell, he said. Come back and tell me what this was all about. The vines began to wrap more and more lengths of green cable around the 2 somewhat alarmed men, who now started to rise slowly and solemnly. Prospero thought for a second of what would happen if this eccentric plant grower was one of Melicus's helpers, or, God forbid, Melicus himself, but he shrugged his shoulders as well as he could, with 6 bands of vine around him, and tightened his grip on the carpet bag. There was no way up but this, and up they went, scraping their backs on hard rocks. The monk, who was waving his watering can at them, got smaller and smaller in the moonlight. By the time they got to the top of the mountain wall, each now had a fat green rubber tire around him. But when they were safe on the broad rock rim, the vines loosened and slithered back down the sheer face. Like someone preparing to go on stage, Prospero stood with his back to the little valley, squared his shoulders, brushed back his hair, and shook granite dust off his sleeves. Finally, he took a deep breath, let it out, and turned around. The valley below him, gray in the rising moon, was a wide, hilly basin of close-cropped grass, dotted with clover. Dark, wrinkled rocks stuck out of folds in the ground. Houses, squatty low shapes with thatched mops, ran in even rows over the one long central ridge. He counted them. 1, 2, 20. Where was the cottage he had stayed in? It must be in the shadows at the back of the valley, up under those 4 upright slabs of stone. Then he turned and saw Roger. Roger stood listening. His arms were raised to fend off something, and he was staring in fear at the pleasant little town, as if it were about to fly at him in a hail of boards and stone. Finally, he lowered his arms, wiped his face, and turned to Prospero. His voice showed that he was breathing heavily. You know, all the way up here, I thought to myself, what if we are going to the wrong place? What if we are leaving the field of battle, where we ought to meet Melicus and try to beat him? I don't think that now. There's something here all right, and it doesn't like us. We are going to have a hard time getting out of this place. Prospero looked around him. I don't feel anything. That may be a bad sign, because this fight is mainly between Melicus and me. Maybe I'm not meant to notice anything yet. Well, come on, said Roger. Let's see what's down here. We may as well give up all hope of sneaking up to the cottage unnoticed. If they can't see two men silhouetted in moonlight at the edge of a cliff, they won't see us if we walk through the middle of their town. They stumbled down the long slope of loose and broken stones that led to the edge of the sweet-smelling clover field. The houses in the distance had looked dark from above, and now they looked just as dark. This is strange, said Prospero. It's only 8 o'clock at night, and even in a little farming town, there'd be one light. And look, the shutters are closed. Yes, they really have a wild life up here. Prospero and Roger walked on, listening for some sound, some barking dog or screeching night-walking cat. When they reached the little town, the houses seemed more than dark. They were empty, abandoned and dead. Blackness lay in the cracks of the broken shutters, and in the spaces between doors and sills. Prospero walked up to one silent cottage and rapped several times on the door. He heard nothing, but as he stood waiting, his hand passed near the keyhole. A cold draft, so cold that it stung his palm, was blowing from inside the house. He turned and walked back to Roger, who was looking around him with more and more apprehension. Roger, this is more than very strange. Didn't that silly monk say that there were people who threw him out? Yes, he did, but they may not have been people. Let's go on. A little farther ahead, nothing was very far from anything else in this tiny town, was the marketplace, a square plot overgrown with weedy grass and withered dandelion stems. In the middle was a fountain with a low carved curb. Fountains were common enough in marketplaces, but this one was quite elaborate. The sides of the round basin were carved into several bas-relief panels. And in the center was the figure of a hooded man reading. Unfortunately, the fountain was not running and the basin was full of dirt and flowers. Very odd-looking flowers. Prospero sat on the smooth-worn lip of the basin and tweaked a leaf with his finger. These are strange flowers. You remember what the monk said, Roger? He said they had flowers up here you wouldn't... Roger suddenly leaped forward and grabbed Prospero's hand and jerked him away so violently that the two of them fell in a heap on the ground amid many shouts and what the devils, all of them from Prospero. He picked himself up and stared at Roger, who was himself staring intently at the fountain. Now what in God's name? The flowers! Didn't you see the monk's drawing? You didn't see the monk's drawings, but I did. The monk? The one down there with the plants? Why... Oh, good Lord, the plants in the book. Yes, and let us now have a look at those carved panels, if we dare. Roger's voice was shaking. The panels, to neither man's surprise, were familiar. The Witch of Endor, the silhouetted figure in the terrible black window, and the other pictures, which they never found out, for as Prospero was straightening up, after looking at the first two, he saw a candle burning in a window down the street on the right. Look, yes, I see it, and I want to run, but we must go to it. At this point, anything else would be insane, don't you think? Roger agreed, and they slowly started to walk toward the little haloed light. It was shining in the front window of a stone house that was a little larger than the two on either side of it. Its roof was of slate, and the shingles looked newly laid. For whatever good it would do them, Prospero and Roger stayed close to the shadowed walls and eaves of the nearer house as they edged down the lane. Finally, they were at the corner of the large house, and they flattened themselves against the rough stuccoed wall. Prospero was the first to reach the window, and much against his better judgment and shouting of his instincts, he looked. What he saw was an old white-maned man, his back to the window. He was seated at a polished table, and he was reading a book. A single candle in a pewter stand dribbled wax on the dark varnished surface. Nearby on the table lay a half loaf of bread, from which a piece had been roughly torn, and there was a tin cup that might have had wine in it. In the few seconds that Prospero stood there looking, he felt terribly afraid. He imagined that the faint steam from his breath on the pane would catch the old man's eye, but the reading figure did not move. Prospero edged back, and Roger squeezed past him to look. A couple of seconds later, they were both on all fours, crawling back to the alley between the two houses. They whispered excitedly. "To think he is up here," said Roger. but it does make sense in a way. Do you think he knows we're here? No, said Prospero, crossing himself. If you want my opinion, I think that hell could gape and not tear him away from that cursed book. He's caught, and then maybe we are too. But then maybe we are too. At least we know why he stopped chasing us, said Roger. Which way is your cottage? Do you have any idea which way it is? North, said Prospero, pointing up the dark valley. I think we had better get on our hands and knees till we get out of this lane, and then run like the devil for the back of the valley. Follow me. The two men crept along slowly, lifting their satchels and setting them down softly a few feet in front of them. And when they were in the open, behind the houses, they ran, but nothing followed them from that dark house. The shadows of the four monoliths rose higher over them as they ran. Roger tripped on a stone and almost fell. Where is it? Maybe he's torn it down. No, there it is, just a little farther. There it was, a narrow wooden house with Gothic-pointed windows and a steep roof. As they got closer, Roger could tell that this had been mainly Prospero's work, not Melicus's. The posts that held up the sagging porch roof were carved into beanstalks, and a few traces of the original yellow paint could be seen in the cracks. Knobbly white wooden icicles dripped from the eaves, and the deep paneled front door had an oval stained glass insert. Up on the creaky porch, the two wizards set down their bags and stared a minute at the dark jewel glass. Roger lit a match. Do you suppose the key the farmer gave you fits this lock? No, said Prospero, who was rummaging on the inside pocket of his winter cloak. I have carried the key to this door with me for years. When I'm looking for the key to the root cellar or the linen closet, I always come across the thing and wonder why I keep it. He pulled out a small iron ring full of different sized keys, selecting a big one with a quatrefoiled handle. He placed it on the cherub mouth in the lock piece of the lock plate. The door rattled open. Roger shut it after them and lit another match, and they saw the shadowy outline of a few small wooden chairs. An empty copper candlestick stood nearby on a dusty table, and Prospero stuck a lighted candle, his last one, on it. Well, here we are, he said. Now if I can only remember where I put that globe. If it's still here, said Roger. Look at the floor. The dusty gray boards in front of them were covered with long, narrow footprints. Prospero stood looking at them. He bit his lips several times until it hurt, and he started nervously clenching and unclenching his fists. It was to be expected, but he can't take it away. His voice dropped. At least, I think he can't. Come on, I remember where I put it, and I was the last one out. He grabbed the candlestick and led Roger to a corner cupboard at the back of the cottage's one large room. The round top door stood on a little waist-high sill, and its knob, a piece of blue-streaked porcelain, was startlingly cold to the touch. While Roger held the candle, Prospero opened the cupboard. Inside, he knew by Melicus. Inside, he could see stacks and bowls and plates, last used, as far as he knew, by Melicus himself. On a separate shelf, over the others, was the great green glass paperweight. He was almost afraid to touch it, and he reached for it twice, pulling his hand away each time. Finally, he closed his fingers on it. It was colder than the knob had been, and he lowered it carefully. Roger saw that he was covering it with his hand, and we will pause there.